It's 5-5. We'll just go ahead. Before I give to my colleague, Ms. Nisha, today we gratefully acknowledge the presence of Vice Admiral Muralidharan, Commodore Vijay Garg, and other distinguished participants and delegates here today. Uh, at the outset, I would also like to thank Dr. Zeno Leoni for taking his time out to be with us, and also Mr. Tanvi Jaikishan, esteemed member C3S, for immediately accepting to moderate this discussion because Commodore R.S. Vasan, due to his indisposition, he was not able to moderate and steer the session today. Thank you to Tanvir ji also. With this, I would like to hand it over to my colleague, Ms. Nisha, smoothly conduct the proceedings. Over to you, Nisha.
Thank you, sir. Good evening and a very warm welcome to all of you who have taken time out of your busy schedules to be with us this evening. I also gratefully acknowledge the presence of the esteemed members of C3S who have also joined us here today. It is my privilege to welcome you all to this C3S NMF institutional dialogue titled US-China Competition, A New Cold War. To speak to us on this subject, we have with us today Dr. Zeno Leoni, Teaching Fellow, Defense Studies Department, King's College, London. Without further ado, I'd like to hand over the rest of the session to our moderator for the day, Mr. Tanvir J. Kishan, member C3S, to deliver his opening remarks and introduce the speaker. Over to you, Mr. Tanvir.
Thank you, Nisha. Good evening, everybody, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you all for attending today. I hope that everybody is safe and well in their respective locations around the world. I'm going to divide my introduction into three parts. I'm going to take a couple of minutes introducing C3S, then our distinguished speaker for the day, then the topic, and then I will turn it over to Dr. Leoni. So the Chennai Center for China Studies is a public policy think tank that was founded in 2008. And its objective, its primary and sole objective, is to study all things China, from the trade to the economy to geopolitics, culture, defense. And over the last 12 years, C3S has brought together folks from different walks of life, from those who have served in uniform, from retired bureaucrats, civil servants, diplomats, leaders who have worked in multilateral institutions and who have rich experience dealing with their Chinese counterparts, along with avid sinologists and Chinese watchers, to help understand and study China, especially in this 21st century and especially under Xi Jinping, and come out with relevant policy documentation that could be of aid from those who make these decisions to those with just a simple curiosity in trying to learn a bit more about China and its place in the world. In 2016, C3S launched the Young Minds program. And I'm very happy to say that in the last 5 years, C3S has mentored about 250 young scholars and nurtured their sort of interest in sinology and geopolitics. What I'm also happy to report is that in the 2021 list of think tanks launched by the Think Tank and Civil Studies Program, Lauder Institute, University of Pennsylvania, C3S has been ranked 33 out of 101 in top think tanks in China, India, Japan, Russia, and Korea. It's being ranked 47 out of 143 in best independent think tank category globally. And it's been ranked the #1 best independent think tank in India for 2021. So a lot of milestones achieved in 12 years. Now we come to today's distinguished speaker, Dr. Zeno Leoni. Sir, thank you for taking the time out and speaking with us. A brief introduction of Dr. Leoni. Dr. Leoni is a teaching fellow in Challenges to the International Order at the Defense Studies Department of King's College, London, based within the Joint Services and Staff College of the Defense Academy of the United Kingdom. He is also an affiliate to the Lao China Institute of King College, London, where he is co-convener of the same institute's policy brief series named China in the World. Last year and this year, he is a visiting scholar in Defense and Security Studies at Nebraska University. In 2021, he published a monograph titled American Grand Strategy from Obama to Trump, Imperialism After Bush and China's Hegemonic Challenge. In the same year, he is also going to publish a chapter on US-China competition in the Middle East, North Africa region as part of the Routledge Handbook on China and the Middle East and North Africa. Dr. Leoni is also engaging policymakers in Italy and the United Kingdom Last year, he worked within the Italian Joint Chiefs of Defense Staff to write Italy's first civil military procedure, Future Trends, Concept 2040 plus document, which analyzes geopolitical, technological, environmental, and economic trends. In the UK, he recently supported the Permanent Joint Headquarters during a study on China. At the Joint Services and Staff College, he teaches courses on China for the Higher Command and Staff course, whose members come from the Five Eyes countries and have the rank of general or equivalent. Meanwhile, every year in Rome, he delivers a guest lecture at the Italian Higher Studies Institute, the Italian Defense Higher Studies Institute, Italy's premier defense education institution. Dr. Leoni is the executive director of ITSS Verona, which is the International Team for Study of Security Verona, which is a non-profit cultural association committed to spreading knowledge in the broadly conceived field of international security. Podcasts, conferences, and his podcasts, conferences, and webinars are available and will be and the link will be certainly circulated during the course of this dialogue. Now, introducing the topic before I turn it over to Dr. Leoni. When we think of a Cold War, right, our mind conjures up images, or we tend to primarily think in terms of a clash of ideologies, fundamentally capitalism versus communism. And when we think of the Cold War, we think of images of proxy wars. We think of, large wars like Vietnam and Afghanistan with high casualties. We think of revolutions, and we think of coups d'etats in countries all over the world, backed by the United States and Soviet Union. However, the 21st century is fundamentally different. It's become a lot more peaceful relative to the last 50 years. So when we think of US-China competition and we think of a US-China Cold War, we're not looking at it as a sort of ideological clash per se, but we're looking at it as a sort of great power competition where a rising power is challenging an established power, sort of like a Thucydides trap. The battlefields of today have shifted from the physical to the virtual. Cyber wars, hybrid warfare, information warfare, and active measures targeting social media to influence the way a target country's population perceives its leadership, its socio-economic issues have become the new domains of war. For more on this topic, I will now turn to Dr. Leoni to commence his discussion. I request all members to please keep their audio on mute. Questions can be posted in the box, and Dr. Leoni will answer as many as he can, time permitting. Over to you, sir. Thank you.
Do let me know if there is any issue. So thanks a lot. Congratulations for all the work you're doing with the Chennai Center for China Studies. It sounds very interesting, and above all, it's a very important topic you're covering. And I'm very happy to connect with you. Especially because this gives me an opportunity to engage with an audience that normally I don't talk to, because I live on a different side of the world, and there is a geography to our profession, even if everything is online and interconnected nowadays. So I'm going to upload my PowerPoint, and so. Yeah, here it is. Yeah, okay. And I'll put it in presentation mode. Right, at this point, I can't see you. Probably you can't see me, but you can see the PowerPoint. So essentially, I'll take you through the main contents of my book. And we will conclude with a slide on that will compare the Cold War, the new Cold War to the original Cold War. And then we can have some Q&A, and you can ask me about the US, China, and more broadly, the changing international environment, if you wish. Right, so over the next 35, 45 minutes, I would like to talk about the changing balance of power. I'll have one slide on Lenin's theory of interstate rivalry, which I used for my book. I want to discuss the contradictions of the blowback of American grand strategy towards China, because I'm arguing that the rise of China is also the product of a contradictions of American grand strategy. I want to look at some similarities between Obama and Trump's foreign policy towards China, US-China competition in the Indo-Pacific, and then we'll spend some time looking at differences and similarity between the two Cold War. If we agree that we are currently in a new Cold War, this is still debated, of course. Right, so the topic we are discussing about today is happening amidst a changing global order, where the balance of power is changing. And I was saying earlier on that I was excited because it's the first time I'm talking to an audience which geographically is east of Suez. And the expression east of Suez has become popular again in the UK, as they just published their strategy about global Britain. And it's really telling of the fact that also the UK, like many other countries, have acknowledged that the international order is changing. And obviously India is a very important part in this transition. So what is the crisis of the liberal international order? Why it is changing? There are many different scholarly contributions here. Scholars, they all agree that there is a shift, that we live in a historical transition, but they all emphasize, as you know, different reasons. There is who criticizes, there is who thinks that liberalism is flawed, and so the liberal international order is structurally flawed. There is who believes that the crisis of the Leo is actually the crisis of American power. There is others who argue that this is just a temporary crisis that will be over after Trump, after Brexit, after Bolsonaro and Orban, respectively, in Brazil and Hungary, will be gone. However, of all these academic contribution, I find most interesting for my job the one from Farid Zakaria. You can find it highlighted in yellow, who talks about the rise of the rest. And I really think that the crisis, this historical transition, is really about a shift in the global balance of power. I cannot go through every aspect of it, but for me, it means, first of all, the rise of China, and more broadly, the economic and military rise of Asia. The fact that the United States has increasingly struggled with, influencing its allies as it used to do during the Cold War. Also, the fact that the US has become energetically independent and so doesn't need the Middle East as it used to nowadays, and also the fact that the US is facing a crisis of insolvency. Let's face it, China has a big budget. The United States is facing an era of austerity, especially after the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. And so we live in the post-American world order, so a world order that is not unipolar anymore, a world order where American power is challenged by other countries, but above all by the rise of China. And to make it even more to make the rise of China even more challenging, I think it's important to remember that it's not just about the rise of China in general, but it's also about the fact that China is rising over, is geographically placed over a highly strategic region for global trade. And especially I'm thinking about the South China Sea, the fact that there is a quarter of world trade that travels through that regions, those waters, a big part of liquefied natural gas and also oil coming from the Middle East travels through the South China Sea. And of course, there are other issues about fishery, exploiting the undersea territory, but also, symbolic historical claims, symbolic issues, and territorial claims. Right. I don't want to bother you too much with academic or theoretical perspective, but I want to dedicate just one slide to the kind of lens that I used to write my book, which I haven't said that, but it was actually produced by Springer Nature in Chennai. And so why I found Lenin's theory of interstate rivalry useful? I did so because essentially the Marxist perspective in Lenin's works means that, of course, Marxists think that capitalist society leads to inequality between people, right? Between the elite and the working class. And so they think that the capitalist economy leads to zero-sum relations. Lenin applied this idea not just to the domestic, but also to international relations, explaining that the capitalism has an uneven geoeconomics or an uneven geography. And so, countries across history, across decades, they can rise and fall depending on where, the economy finds more profitable avenues. And the rise of China is really about that. It's about the fact that the West has started to invest more and more in China. And at some point, China has started to drain economic resources from the West. This is the uneven development of capitalism. And so for Lenin, this kind of unevenness, this kind of rise and fall of great powers, leads to hegemonic shift or interstate or inter-imperial rivalries. And this is what, in my view, explains current US-China competition. There is another aspect to Lenin's theory, which is the fact that amidst this rise and fall of great power, each state allies to their industrial combines, to their big businesses. You can think of this in terms of the United States and the Silicon Valley on the one hand, and on the other hand, China and Huawei, for example. And this really is at the core of the current new Cold War, the fact that it's not just about the US and China, but it's about US businesses and competing with Chinese businesses. And obviously, if the US or the state who can win this competition then can arrange the terms of global trade in a way that is more favorable to their national companies, to their national businesses. So this is very important. Right. So I said at the start that I wanted to address a contradiction within American grand strategy. And this is what I call blowback. And this is very important in order to understand US-China relations. So in my book, I disagree with neorealist authors. Neorealist authors think that liberal hegemony weakened was a problem for American grand strategy. I actually think that liberal hegemony gave a lot of success to the United States. But I think it also contains the seeds of the limits, the flaws of American grand strategy. And the flaw is the fact that it tends to lead to blowback or backlashes. Right, what is a blowback in the context of my book? The blowback is the fact that since since the Cold War, the United States, with Nixon, with Kissinger, they sought to promote reforms, economic reforms in China, for China to develop. The United States needed that because it needed a big economy like China to stimulate the global economy, right? To compete, to participate, to buy, to export. And this was very important because the liberal international order was an open economy which was set on terms favorable to American industries. And so if China was to prop up, to boost the global economy, ultimately this was at the advantage of American companies. And also the United States wanted to untap the economic resources of a huge market like China, which was, until the Mao era, closed. And so since the Deng Xiaoping's reform, we see this further and further liberalization of China supported by the United States. But that's actually where the blowback, where the backlash comes from, because China never really, because of the uneven and combined development of capitalism, because of a strong Chinese Communist Party, China has always open to the global economy, but has never given up its political power, its nationalist control of the Chinese economy. And this is a big deal in US-China relations. And so that's what I call the blowback. The fact that the US helped China to become a great power. But actually, ultimately, China became a big competitor of the United States. So in a way, US foreign policy, if we look at in over 40 decades, it undermined itself in a way. And I can talk more about this if there is any question. And the blowback continued since the end, especially with the end of the Cold War, with Clinton and Bush. And especially Bill Clinton was a great advocate of bringing China into the World Trade Organization, and so of allow China to liberalize, to open up its economy. But of course, China never did that, because China, one of the core interests of China, which is explained in its white papers, is that it needs to maintain the rule of and the power of the Chinese Communist Party, together with other issues like territorial integrity. So Bill Clinton brought China into the WTO, and actually, but as he was doing that, he was starting to realize that China wasn't changing, and that actually China was starting to develop its, to increase its defense expenditures. And so before the elections of George W. Bush, so before the 2000 election, the election in 2000 of the United States, George Bush was promising a tougher foreign policy against China, because his administration was seeing that what was coming in a way. But then 9/11 happened, and the strategic, the grand strategic, geostrategic priority of the Bush administration changed. And so for many years, China wasn't a priority of the United States anymore. And in those years, China was rising and rising, until, of course, until the famous speech of the responsible stakeholders, which came in 2006, where actually the United States started to realize that China wasn't reforming its capitalism, but China was simply taking advantage of being in the global economy. But it was doing it according to its own terms, according to terms that were favorable to Beijing. And so in order to see a shift in US foreign policy and US-China relations, we need to wait Obama's pivot to Asia, which I will talk about in a few minutes. So here is another image of the blowback between the US and China. So essentially, as China was rising, it was becoming both the United States' best friend and worst enemy at the same time. And this is why we're talking about a new Cold War nowadays, because they're enemy, but they're also friends, so they cannot fight each other because the consequences would be too high. And so, competition is happening on a different level, as it was reminding during the introduction prior to my presentation. So they're best friend because China has become the world economy locomotive. And the United States, the US economy needs China to play that role. So it's extremely important. Imagine if there was a financial crisis in China, for example. That would be a big problem for the United States. And so the US wants China to thrive, to succeed. But on the other hand, China is competing in this world economy, following its national interest, without liberalizing, with state-owned enterprises, with state-led businesses, and is becoming increasingly competitive in an area which has become very sensitive nowadays, the one of high-tech industries, the internet, telecommunications, robotics, semiconductors, and so on. And China has also become more competitive, while not complying with the rules of the WTO, which ultimately is a US-friendly, or it used to be, it was conceived as a US-friendly, US-sponsored institutions. And last but not least, as I said earlier on, China also has revisionist geopolitical ambitions over a highly strategic region of the world, the Western Pacific. This is just to provide you a figure of how China has been changing, while the US wasn't paying attention to that. So roughly over the last 20 years, the US economy doubled, the GDP doubled. China's GDP over the same period grew 12 times. US military expenditures, the US military budget almost doubled, but the Chinese military budget has grown more than 15 times over the same period. And this is a lot, and we can start to feel the implications of that in the Indo-Pacific, as I will discuss later. Somebody was telling me, but yeah, so the United States spends 3 times what China spends in terms of defense budget. Yes, but there is a difference. The United States continues to aspire to be to patrol the global commons, the sea lanes of the world across its 5 commands. And so, in a way, the United States, as the neo-realists argue, it's military overstretched, while China, at the moment, although this is changing, as perhaps we can discuss that in the Q&A, China is focusing its firepower mostly internally in its internal 5 domestic theaters, and above all over the Western Pacific, the South China Sea, the East China Sea, what we call within the first island chain. And so this gives China a great advantage, a relative advantage, if you want. Of course, overall, in absolute terms, the US remains more powerful. Right, so I want to take you through US grand strategy from Obama to Trump with regard to China, very briefly, because I think it's important to see how the relationship is evolving. Essentially, my argument is that, first of all, we have had an Obama-Trump grand strategy. So there was a lot of strategic continuity, same long-term objectives, but a lot of tactical differences. So different style, different way of achieving those strategic objectives. They both agreed on the need of extricating the United States from the main commitment of the Bill Clinton and George W. Bush era. And they also agreed on the need of not wasting energies about, with exporting democracy, for example. This was a strong continuity. And also they agreed on the fact that the United States needed to focus more on interstate competition rather than terrorism. And why? And this was mostly because of the rise of China, and more in general because the global balance of power is changing, as I tried to explain. Right, so this is just to show you, and I think this is perhaps interesting from an Indian perspective, a comparison between the pivot to Asia and the free and open Indo-Pacific, so Obama's strategy and Trump's strategy. So in terms of discourse at the top, Obama had a very romantic narrative highlighting the fact that the US shares a geography, shares a culture with the Asia-Pacific, also with India, a democratic culture. While Trump's discourse was mostly about recovering a very old theme in American culture, which is manifest destiny, and the need of opposing empire, which is something that the US 200 years ago used to say about the European monarchies. And now Trump was using that against China. A very important piece in this puzzle is the foreign economic policy of both Obama and Trump. So Obama sought to contain China with the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which was a multilateral framework which sought to penalize, undermine the state capitalism and state-owned enterprises in Asia-Pacific trade. And so it was a very not confrontational, nuanced way of containing China. On the other hand, Trump, a nationalist, somebody who believes in bilateral relations, he was much more confrontational, and he sought to achieve the same aim of the TPP by using the tariffs. And actually, let me be clear about this. The main objective of this policy, American policy towards China, were about coercing the Chinese Communist Party into implementing privatization, democratic reforms, and essentially breaking the link between Chinese capitalism and the Chinese state. And you know, this is a big deal, for example, when it comes to Huawei and more in general to US investments in Europe, in the Middle East, in Australia, and in many other parts of the world. And then similarly, Obama and Trump, they increased military they focused the military posture of the United States more on the Indo-Pacific. And clearly, with both presidents, the Asia-Pacific became and above all, the Indo-Pacific became a diplomatic priority. And I think there is a very important nuance here in the free and open Indo-Pacific of Trump. First of all, the fact that the US-led containment against China is a maritime containment, and also the fact that India is a pillar in this strategy. Right, so with regard to competition in the Indo-Pacific between the US and China, I'm somebody who works on grand strategy, international relations, but I read for my work the writings of military analysts, and also my colleagues at the Defense Academy and my students, they work in this area. And according to military analysts, on the one hand, the United States needs to realize that China wants to expel the United States from certainly from the Western Pacific, perhaps from the Indo-Pacific. We will see about that. Not necessarily from China wants to become a world hegemon. But also, and this is very important, we cannot take for granted the fact that the United States is the military hegemon in the Indo-Pacific, as it used to be during the Cold War. So this is a kind of reality check that these military analysts are advocating for. But I think one of my arguments in the book is that there are differences between the Western Pacific Ocean and the Indian Ocean, and this difference will stay there for a long time. I think it's important to highlight that, especially because we're talking about a huge geography, and sometimes this political label they tend to not to capture the reality. So I think this is a picture about China's A2AD anti-air access denial and its short and medium and long range missiles. Essentially, this picture is telling us that China is probably would be able to win a short-term conflict in within the first island chain. So the region that goes from the south of Japan through the Ryukyu Islands, Taiwan, the Philippines, down to the South China Sea. And especially would be able to win the conflict if it was to take the initiative, to act first, and especially because the United States has some of its assets outside the region, in the Hawaii, in California. It would take a few weeks for the United States to bring all these assets to the theater and eventually, together with its allies, manage to tilt the balance of military power. But of course, you know, China would be able to win, to take actions, to perhaps even sub-threshold, in front of which the United States might say, okay, it's not convenient for us to engage in a fight in order to tilt the balance of power. So This is just to say that China appears to have an advantage, although perhaps we can talk about whether later on the Chinese doctrine, military doctrine, is advising Chinese policymakers to do something like that. I don't think it's advising that. Actually, it's advising the contrary, perhaps. So maybe we can talk about that later. Instead, in the Indian Ocean, the situation is very different, in my view. I mean, you can see it in this map. First of all, this is not a narrow geography like in the South China Sea, where China could kind of, use the geography and the militarization of islands to develop a shield, a natural shield in a way. Here is in the Indian Ocean. There's plenty of U.S. assets, NATO assets, Indian assets, and there is also, there's the Fifth Fleet in Bahrain. The US has access to the British territory in the Indian Ocean of Diego Garcia. There's Djibouti. China, to my knowledge, all it has is a military base in Djibouti, which is very far from home. And so, I mean, would China be able to engage in a prolonged fight in this region against the US and other countries if it wanted to? That I don't think so, especially because, and this is very important, because if China was to take any action in the South China Sea, Western powers or India or other countries could retaliate by stopping the flow of energetic resources in the Indian Ocean. And this is also why China needs the Belt and Road Initiative and Central Asian infrastructures in order to have an alternative avenue for Middle Eastern oil to come to China. But China is equipping for that, and I'm sure, among the audience there is experts in maritime military, in sea power, and I just want to say that China is trying to change that. Is aiming to have between 2 and 4 additional aircraft carriers by 2030, because it wants to move to a more Mahanian military posture. So moving from sea denial in the South China Sea to sea control in open space. But to this stage, China only has 2 aircraft carriers. One is an old Ukraine Soviet carrier. The other is built upon this, that carrier, so that similar model, and so it's not really. It doesn't allow China, as I said, to conduct those long-term hostilities away from home. And this is also why another area I'm looking at. This is also why China cannot play a meaningful role from a military point of view in the Gulf and the Middle East yet. I'm talking to an Indian audience, and I'm also looking at, in my book, at some of the alliances that the US has in Asia. So perhaps it's worth spending just a few minutes on that. So the US will rely, given the neutrality of ASEAN, the US will rely, or will hope that it can rely on the quadrilateral security dialogue. So India, Japan, and Australia. I think it's we don't know how this will play out at this stage, because Japan is, I think, a very faithful ally of the United States, but is increasingly vulnerable to Chinese anti-air access denial technology. And so, to what extent Japan will be able to support the United States in a conflict with China, I don't know. This is not clear yet. On the other hand, I think geographically India is better placed, and I think India will be the player that will make a difference in this relationship, especially from the point of view of Asian security, from a military point of view. However, I don't know whether, and perhaps you can comment on that later on. I don't know whether I'm aware that India wants to have a certain strategic autonomy, and I think at the start of the Modi era was perhaps more sympathetic to China. Lately, it has become perhaps closer to the United States, as some events confirm. But I don't know whether we can conclude that India will always be on the side of the United States in terms of Asian security. Perhaps you can help me with that, but I think there is a degree of uncertainty dictated by the fact that India will want to have a strategic autonomy. And this also goes with the fact that, as I say, the global balance of power is changing. Last but not least, Australia, again, a very close ally of the United States, but China has become the most important economic partner for Australia. And so Australia, like any other country in the West, like the UK, like Italy, like the US, it's facing a big dilemma between security and economic interest. I call it the economy security conundrum. So we will have to see. It will be interesting to see how Australia will play the fact that it is in between these two big players. Right. So I'm approaching the end of the presentation. So is the one between the US and China a new Cold War? I think that on the one hand, yes. On the other hand, no. So it depends what kind of aspect we're looking at. So in terms of differences, clearly there is a huge difference here. It's economic interdependence. That's obvious. And also the fact that we live in a multipolar world order. This is not so countries. This is not bipolar. Countries do not have necessarily to choose to stay either with the US or with China. That's a very important difference. There are other differences. This is the fact that I don't think in the US-China relation there is a nuclear dynamic as there used to be between the US and the USSR. However, there are important similarities. For example, there is the risk of mutual distraction from an economic point of view. And so the fact that, for example, China owns the US debt, but China is aware that that is a nuclear option. So if China was to withdraw, to sell the US debt all of a sudden, or to stop financing that debt, there would be huge repercussion for China. Another similarity is the fact that this is a global conflict, global fight. They fight everywhere. So they fight over COVID, they fight over Hong Kong, they fight over the death of George Floyd in the United States. They polemize, they compete over US allies, Italy, the UK. These have been at the center, and Australia. These have been at the center of huge pressures, like Israel and Gulf partners. But also, this is a global Cold War because they fight over certain industries. They fight over technology. And we just need to think about Huawei's 5G, just to make an example. And so there is, I don't think there are proxies on the one hand, but on the other hand, there are a lot of many fronts that are open, and we don't know how this will play out. Ultimately, there is also a gray area in this Cold War, in this new Cold War. There are several examples, and I think it deserves some mention, the ideological differences between the US and China. Clearly, this is not like the ideological differences that we used to see during the Cold War, but it's a big problem, the fact that, well, for the US, the problem is not the fact that China is communist. The problem is that China is nationalist. And so it maintains a nationalist foreign economic policy and foreign military policy. So that's the main problem for China, for the US. And so there is an ideological divide, but to an extent. And also it was interesting to see, at least until Biden, how both Obama and Trump somehow tried to reapproach Russia. in a way, in a similar way to how the US approached China during the Cold War to bring it, to take it away from the Soviet Union. I'm happy to chat further about this in the Q&A. But before I conclude, I just wanted to say that the new Cold War, the US-China relations, as I said earlier on, is not just, I mean, this is a very important dynamic in the current international system. But it's not, it probably is the most important, but it's not the only one. I think, generally speaking, the kind of military multipolarity, the changing balance of power towards Asia, and the differences and intra-regional relations in Asia and the Asia-Pacific, this is also a big deal. I mean, this is something that will have great implications. It will affect the new Cold War between the US and China. And so while, for me, this is an extremely important dynamic, the new Cold War, I think is not the only one that we need to follow. And in the Asia-Pacific, we will see a lot of important events and consequences of this changing balance of power. Right, I'm at the end of my presentation. If you could allow me to just talk to you about my association very briefly. This is a network. We just constituted a board of a committee of scientific committee with 100 scholars from all over the world. We deliver webinars, we deliver podcasts, video podcasts on YouTube. We have a very interesting website. And I mean, we got military students, civilian students who have joined us. Please do have a look at the website and at our free features, if you want, which are this. You just need to find It's Verona on YouTube. There is a lot of free content, so do have a look at it and see whether you like our lectures, our podcast, and eventually feel free to get in touch. I would really appreciate that. And right, I think I can stop here, so there will be more time for some Q&A. I will stop sharing my PowerPoint.
Thank you so much, Dr. Leoni, for that very comprehensive talk on the subject. We'll just move into the question and answer session now. I'll begin by reading out the questions in the chat box, and you can answer those questions for us. I request everyone else to kindly mute yourselves. The first question is from Mr. L.V. Krishnan, sir, and he asks, what influence do the US multinational corporations have in the US-China competition, for the better or worse?
Thank you. That's a terrific question. I wish I would have had the chance to. I wish in my future research to have the chance to explore that more. I think the only way to do that is to interview big businesses, especially those in the Silicon Valley. I think their role is. Well, they're in a very difficult position because they depend on China very much. For example, the Apple, the iPhone, is designed in the United States, but can only be produced in China, not only because China produces it cheaply, but also because China has the ability of bringing together lots of workers in the same city, in the same workplace, which is something that the US cannot do. So this is just probably the most important example to say that these big businesses are very influencing, and they have tried to stop Trump from continuing the trade war. They've exerted pressure to stop Trump from continuing that. In my book, I explain that Trump, in order to ensure that these big businesses accepted his protectionist foreign policy towards China, he conducted a reform of, he lowered big corporation taxes in the United States. And so this meant that the big businesses found Trump's foreign policy towards China more acceptable. However, I mean, this is a huge dilemma. I'm not sure there is a solution because, in a way, in the short term, big businesses are penalized by Trump's trade war. But in the long term, they will benefit from being protected from the United States, from being attached to a strong hegemon, and also from legislation on theft of intellectual property, and so I mean this is the big dilemma. I think I know they have pressured the Trump administration, but perhaps they haven't been as vocal as somebody would think. But this is something I really would like to explore more in the future and conduct interviews with managers from the Silicon Valley. I hope I have the chance to do that.
Thank you for that answer. The next question is from Mr. Danesh, and it's regarding the recent Russia-Ukraine clashes. He says, will it affect the US to change its foreign policy like what happened post 9/11?
Right. I think to answer the question, we would need to attempt some prediction about Biden, because until Biden, I think it was very clear, as I mentioned in the final slide about trying to not to bother Russia too much. I think it was very clear that the United States didn't want to, with Obama and Trump, didn't want to contain, to engage militarily Russia in Eastern Europe. Obama said that very clearly. He said that no matter what we think or we do, Ukraine will always be affected by the influence of Russia. So there's not much we can do. And I think that was coherent with also the Trump's posture, even though Trump gave more money to the European Defense Initiative. Now with Biden, we see a president who just called Putin a killer, who seemed to be more keen to be tougher on Russia. But I think we will have to see. We'll have to wait and see what happens, because I don't see the US, starting a war in Europe. I think there have been clear indications that Europe, the Middle East, are less of a priority for the United States, and they want to be an offshore balancer. So they don't want to move, they don't want to use their land forces. Perhaps they might support NATO in a military effort in Eastern Europe, of course. So it's very uncertain, and also the mood since Obama, also the academic mood. If you read the writings of neorealist scholars, has been about advocating restraint, and it might be that Biden will try to avoid restraint by playing more with allies, but I don't think there will be any major changes.
The next question is
Nisha, sorry, your microphone went off.
I think this. Yeah, I can take it up, Dr. Leoni. Next question they have by Colonel Hariharan. He has asked, in the evolving strategic dynamics of Indo-Pacific, how do you see the future of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and BRICS, in which India is involved?
Okay, how do I see the future of those organizations? I think,
with regard to the with regard to the dynamics of Indo-Pacific.
Right. Okay, I think. I mean, I'm not sure about it. I mean, I think the BRICS, the BRICS has been there for a while, and it hasn't really translated in a meaningful alliance. I think today it remains more a label, a slogan. I see more serious, more rigorous strategic intentions in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, but I doubt that it will become a sort of NATO, Eurasian NATO. I mean, I think there will be a lot of cooperation between China and Russia, of course. But then there is India is a question mark here, especially because I don't know. I struggle to predict what will be the posture of India towards China, and so that will be crucial to determine the future of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization in the Indo-Pacific. But it seems to me that India, at the moment, there have been meetings with Trump. India joined the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue. But perhaps Indian policymakers want to keep their cards. They want to keep different options. But I'm interested in if there is an opinion on that from the audience. I look forward to this.
Sir, you're muted, sir. Bala, sir.
Yeah, thanks,
Bala,
Nisha.
you're muted.
Yeah. Next question is by research scholar Ms. Amrita. She has asked, what role will Russia play in determining the dynamics of the new Cold War between USA and China, including the space domain?
Wow, that's a very interesting question. So I think China will. So I think the Russia and China, they have a very healthy relationship. They cooperate, and with regard to gas, for example, they train together from a military point of view. I think there is therefore though a difference, which is something I explore about Eastern Europe and the Arctic, which is that we may find ourselves in situations where Russia is keen to intervene militarily, on whatever issue. Could be the Gulf, could be the Arctic, could be Eastern Europe. And it might be that China will see that kind of intervention as jeopardizing Chinese interests globally. So perhaps that's the Russian factor that could impact the new Cold War, that could actually undermine China or a Sino-Russian relations. In terms of undermining the US, I was discussing the other day with a colleague, what if tomorrow Russia invades Ukraine and China at the same time decides to attack Taiwan? I mean, what could the West do? What could the US do about it? And so that would be very challenging. I don't think we see yet that kind of level of military coordination between the Russia and China, exactly for the reasons I just explained. I'm not aware of cooperation in space between Russia and China, but I know that China in space has a very ambitious agenda that runs through 2060 and beyond. And clearly, the United States, if they don't invest more money, they will struggle to keep up with this ambitious agenda. China will invest a lot of money on that, especially with regard to exploiting resources in space.
Thank you, Dr. Leoni. And I have a question. The world is now entering a post-Western era. We see rise of non-Western powers like India and China. But however, as a discipline, international relations is still West-centric. How do you see this?
I think this is a bit like in militarily speaking, there is a grand strategy. A state has a grand strategy, and then the military doctrine needs sometimes to catch up, to adapt to the new requirements of policy. So I think IR in the post-Western world order will be a bit like that. So it will take some time, some years before scholarly debates adapt to a new reality. I mean, we're still debating whether we are moving to a multipolar era. The post-Western question is very interesting because it's not just about post-American, it's actually post-Western in the sense that we see the West being extremely fragmented, especially if we look at transatlantic relations and intra-European relations. and China is an important cause of this fracture. And also not only the rise of China, but also the fact that China has become the cause of a lot of divisions of discussion within Western countries and within the transatlantic alliance. And so I think we can say that we are approaching a post-Western, we're becoming a post-Western world.
Yes, sir. The next question is from Admiral Muralidharan, and sir asks, looking back, did Nixon, Kissinger underestimate China or its thinking while helping it come into the global arena? Further in view, interdependence economically, you mentioned how far would the US be able to push China?
Yeah. Sorry, what was the final part of the question about pushing China?
Further in view of interdependence economically, you mentioned how far would US be able to push China?
Yeah, so I think so the Nixon Kissinger reapproachment of China shouldn't be read only with economic lenses. Clearly, there was also a strategic concern, which was about defeating the USSR. Okay, fine. But yeah, in hindsight, there wasn't so much the mistake. Perhaps that was warranted by the Cold War. But then the bigger mistake was the Clinton administration, which was a very globalist administration, which acted based on the principle of Anthony Lake's national security advisor of Clinton. It's the end of the Cold War. We need to move from containment to enlargement. And so that was a very globalist philosophy. The mistake was that it was overly informed by economic interest as opposed to strategic interest. But actually, that was the post-Cold War debate. So scholars and in the West, we were talking about the unipolar moment, a strategic pose. So that meant there were no enemies around. And so why not focusing on the geoeconomy? And but that was a very short-sighted thing to say. And we realized, we can see it nowadays, how short-sighted it was. And in fact, we just need to look at debates, policy debates in the US, in the UK. Now it has become fashionable again, this idea of whole of government. So cross-departmental coordination, economic policy needs to also take into consideration security issues. There is a shift there, and China is actually influencing that shift because this is how China operates. China operates in a whole of government way. We don't in the West. We're trying to change that. And so yeah, in hindsight, these were mistakes. Yeah.
Yes. Another question from Mr. Balasubramaniam. In your view, how is China able to balance between being open to investments while still maintaining iron curtains over domestic issues like curtailing rights and civil liberties?
Yeah, I mean, this is probably the questions of the question. So while the US needs to rebalance and to bring security back into policy, China is actually facing the opposite dilemma. They need to liberalize to an extent, especially because they got these domestic challenges. But they're aware, they clearly don't want to give up the CCP power. So what I think it will happen is that the CCP will not give up that power. I think that was clear in Hong Kong and Xinjiang last summer. Although I think they are concerned about it, about the need of liberalizing, but I think ultimately their priority is political power, domestic political power. And we have seen that China it wasn't really concerned by the international impact that its actions in Hong Kong and Xinjiang had. And so this tells me that while I agree with you, with Bala Subramanian, that they have this dilemma and they're trying to implement a free market reform, although it's very slow. Ultimately, they will always prioritize the political dimension. And also, if I can add, they've started with this supply side economic reform a few years ago. I think it is encountering all sorts of limitations, bureaucratic obstacles. So it will be, I think, while they have this dilemma, it will be a very slow shift.
The next question is from Mr. Tanveer, and he says, Dr. Leoni, excellent presentation. Does the US even have a grand strategy? Afghanistan was not a 20-year war, but 21-year wars. Iraq was started on dubious grounds, and the vacuum created by the war led to ISIS. America failed to act as an honest broker during the Arab Spring. Its intervention in Libya led to civil war. It failed to enforce red lines in Syria despite leading against ISIS, allowing Russia and Turkey and Iran to fill the void. Now, instead of dealing with Iran constructively, China has been allowed to sign a $400 billion deal.
Yeah, I see. I mean, there are all sorts of contradictions. I think the US has a grand strategy, but very broadly speaking, this has been in place since the end of World War II, and this is about exporting. This is about liberal hegemony, exporting, liberalism, because ultimately it is convenient to the US economy to do that. And so it used to be that military power was acting in the interest of US capitalism, global capitalism. I think why nowadays this seems more confusing is because this system is not favorable to the United States anymore as it used to be until recently. And so it is the US, especially we saw it with Trump, the US realized that China is taking advantage of that. Germany is taking advantage of that. Other Asian countries who have, their, state-led economies are taking advantage of that. And so I think this is creating some confusion in American grand strategy. And how to resolve that? Do we rebuild, reform the liberal international order, but we don't have the power, the influence to do that? Do we go alone? Do we act more isolationist? Do we act as an offshore balancing power? Do we intervene militarily? I think this is, I agree. I mean, the US grand strategy is in a phase of transition. And at the moment, it looks pretty confusing because it struggled to implement the grand strategic objectives that it used to have for many, many decades. So what will be the US grand strategy in a post-Western world order? It's difficult to say. Perhaps the US will continue to be a sea power, offshore balancing sea power, but it will have to act more and more with its allies. It will struggle to play a meaningful role without its allies. And so perhaps that will be the next US grand strategy, realign more on allies.
Yes, sir. The next question is again from Mr. Balasubramanian, and he asks, the US is a liberal democracy and has produced the Silicon Valley. China, despite its denial of human rights violations and civil liberties, is able to come up with its own Silicon Valley that's in the Pearl River Delta. Doesn't it dent notions of liberal theories that science can develop only in a free and open environment?
Thanks a lot. I mean, these are all great questions. I don't think I ever received so many interesting questions. That's amazing. I think, again, going back to the dilemmas of China. So the success of China, right, let me rephrase it. we are realizing that actually this is not the case, that you don't need just liberalism for technological development. But actually, this was never the case. So I've been reading works of scholars who argue that we shouldn't believe in the myth of neoliberalism, in the myth of Apple creating the iPhone or the Mac in a garage, three friends getting together and being creative. The internet was a military invention. It was funded by the state, so there was state research behind that. So this is a myth, the one that neoliberalism leads to innovation, or that democracy leads to innovation. I think it's extremely important to democracy to have innovation, but it's not just about that. And I think the invention of the internet, even the Silicon Valley, is a bit about that. It was the state initially that initiated that research. Now, we see this more and more with China. China has this close cooperation between the state and its industries. This is the secret of its success, in my view. However, it's not enough. They need to, they will need to liberalize if they don't want to face a crisis in creativity, lateral thinking. They need ideas, so they also need some democratic elements. That's why when they invest in Europe, especially in Germany and the UK, they search for partnership with companies that are about research and development, so where they can acquire some know-how. So I agree with you to an extent, but it's also important to highlight that it's a myth, the fact that innovation was always about liberalism and democracy. There was always a state behind, and the US was a powerful state, so a state with resources and could provide the framework, investments, infrastructure for scientists to innovate in a liberal democratic environment. So that's my take on that. Can I add something, because I find it very interesting, this debate about whole of government liberalism, and even The Economist recently. The Economist is a very liberal magazine, and yet they said, well, perhaps we need to revise the classic neoliberal theories and mantras that we have applied over the last decades. So I think it's very telling of how China, to an extent, is compelling us and the Western world to rethink the way we live, neoliberalism, democracy. I hope this will be a self-reflection that leads to improvement. I don't hope that this self-reflection will actually turn into a more authoritarian form of government, which actually there is a risk now with COVID. We see that. I hope this will lead to some improvements, but it always depends on how our policymaker will decide to interpret these changes.
Thank you, Dr. Leoni. There's a question by Mr. Jacob. In the very beginning of Biden's presidency, diplomats exchanged their views on human rights, and Blinken claims that China has violated human rights in terms of China-Tibetan conflict. How do you think the US will approach this significant matter to prevent any further violation of human rights by China?
Right. So I always say we need to go back to the Tiananmen incidents or massacre. There is a debate on whether we use the word incident or massacre. Tiananmen events, when the United States was upset about that, perhaps shocked, especially domestic politics, and yet George H.W. Bush, so George Senior, George Bush father, actually ended up saying that we need to prioritize trade. That perhaps if we keep trading with China, China will change. I keep that into account, and I try to apply to what's happening nowadays with Hong Kong, Xinjiang, Tibet. What I can see, especially looking at the UK, for example, is that perhaps we will continue on two channels. We will keep two channels of communication with China. So diplomatically, very more assertive, criticizing China, sanctioning their officials in Xinjiang, as the UK did. On the other hand, we will continue doing business as usual, because as it was leaked by the Secretary of Foreign Affairs here in the UK, a message when Raab, he was saying that no matter of human rights, we need to trade. And so I think we will continue along these two channels. Obviously, in the case of Chinese investment in the West, this will be scrutinized more. For example, the Huawei deal was killed last year by Boris Johnson. But yeah, I think there will be this kind of modus vivendi, this kind of way of keeping the relationship going. Many people agree that we will continue to cooperate with China where we can. We will continue to oppose China where we cannot cooperate. So it will be a Janus-faced, a kind of double-faced approach to China. Ultimately, these are questions that are very difficult to answer from a practical point of view. And I was looking at UK-China relations over the last 20 years, and this question has been there since after the Hong Kong handover, since when China became a big business partner. And now the Boris Johnson Global Britain integrated review has tried to address that. But it's challenging dilemmas.
Thank you, Dr. Leoni. The last question for this Q&A session would be from Colonel Hariharan. He has asked, what do you think of the Quad Plus framework? Like, for example, France, is it likely France to be included in this Quad Plus framework?
Right. This is not something I followed. I can look at it also through the lens of the UK, who is trying to pivot to Asia. I think European, also if we look at the British pivot to Asia, European countries have realized that the opportunities that there are in Asia. The UK did that since 2010. There is a speech from William Hague, and this is also part of Global Britain. So France, the UK, other countries will want to get the opportunities there. Now, the extent to which, they can contribute with an aircraft carrier, but the extent, I don't think there will be, how can I say, a game changer. France, the UK, I don't think there will be players that will change the game in the region. But yeah, they will contribute with some military assets. Why not? To what extent they will be able to be protagonists? I doubt this is the case. If you look at the GDP of some Asian countries over the next few years, it's an amazing growth, and so European powers will struggle to keep up with that. And also, countries, the UK, for example, is advised by the parliament not to take any, confrontational military posture in the region. And I assume it's the same for other countries like France and like Italy.
Thank you, Dr. Leoni. We have come to the end of the Q&A session. Before I hand it over to the moderator, Mr. Tanviji, since we have today two distinguished officers in white, Vice Admiral Muralidharan sir and Commodore Vijay sir is also there. Can I request some quick comments from both of them, starting with Vice Admiral Muralidharan sir?
Thank you very much, Pala. It has been must firstly compliment Dr. Leoni for a very, very erudite presentation. He's covered all aspects of the issues. But I would like to, and not a question, I would like to just leave him with a thought. We all look at China, and our entire discussion has been on the economics and how it affects the economy of various nations. But there's another angle to it, which countries like India and those others who are actually sharing the border which includes the Russia. And there is always this border issue with China, like India has had recently, Russia has had at some point in time, Vietnam had, and many of these issues. So it's a point for thought that, you know, how does will there be any counter to this kind of hegemony that China is looking at, because he thinks of a Middle Kingdom syndrome, which is of hundreds of years. The psyche is in that of expanding. It's just a point of view. Otherwise, I think you have covered the other aspects extremely well. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Admiral.
Thanks a lot
Commodore
for the
Vijay,
namaste.
sir. Commodore? Can you please unmute yourselves, Commodore? You're muted, please.
Thank you, Murli sir, putting the wider perspective. And Mr. Leoni very nicely covered the whole gambit in the larger areas or issues. I have just 2 points to make. One is that today's what the last question is kind of the Quad and the France getting into it. A lot of questions are being studied. A lot of scenarios building is done. What could happen? Who may come? There are some countries are being thought of maybe directly not involved, but maybe the arms supplies. There's one aspect of that in the Quad, which may need at times. Second part is which Admiral Murli has mentioned, that when you're looking at in the Quad itself, India has its own issues with its own neighbors, which others may not have direct impact on that. But yes, when it comes to a global issue, the Quad comes together. When it comes to maritime frontiers, they are common areas. So that was, it came during the questions and you covered it, you touched it there. I observed one point when you saw a slide of China's interest, the East African ports and the coastline was left. What I observed in say last 10 years in China, that this is the one area I have seen being there on 2-3 ports during my tenures, that this is the areas they are focusing on if they want to come to Indian Ocean. So this is one I thought I observed and was not mentioned anywhere. So this is one area which Chinese are getting more into it. They're not talking about it, but their focus is there. But very nicely talked, very nicely answered. Thank you so much. It's a lovely talk.
Thank you, sir. I also see Colonel Hariharan sir here. May I give brief remarks, if any? Colonel Hari sir?
I thoroughly enjoyed Dr. Leoni's presentation, and I am very grateful to him for giving the larger perspective. We tend to get focused on Indian Ocean. Indo-Pacific is a newer area for us, though the naval guys, of course, have very vast knowledge of it. I am one of the landlubber. So I think it is the Cold War 2.0 is in a flux. It won't have contours as the Cold War 1 had. I think we should reconcile to that. That is one point I want to make. Second point is, this is not going to be a war that will have a date when it starts and when it ends. It is going to be a hybrid thing. It is going to involve technology, economy, trade, particularly maritime trade, and of course, the territorial issues. So I think we cannot have this red lines and blue lines we used to have in wargaming. It is going to be much more complex. I think all of us are evolving in an informatized scenario. We really do not know what are our strengths and what are our weaknesses. I think this is going to make the difference. Particularly, I think we are overestimating Chinese military operational capability on an informatized scenario, joint operations. Having 2 aircraft carriers is not enough. India had been operating aircraft carrier for 50 years. That gives a solid backing, though we might have 1.5 aircraft carriers. I want to point out this as a as a guy who has some knowledge of South Asia and the Indian Ocean. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Colonel Hariharan, Vice Admiral Muralidharan, and Commodore Vijesh Garg, sir. May I now request Tanvir ji to just present his concluding remarks? Over to you, Tanvir ji.
Thank you, Bala, and thank you, Dr. Leoni, for taking the time and sort of speaking to us today. Building on what the Commodore and the Colonel said, India has the great misfortune of sharing a land border with China. And so when we are literally staring down the gun of Chinese expansionism, of Chinese irredentism, and when we see China trying to recreate the Middle Kingdom through brutal tactics, incursions, India as a country has the authority and the moral ability to speak. But at the same time, while we are staring down this gun and while we are focusing on the issues at hand, oftentimes we fail to step back and see the bigger picture. And while we have a phenomenal Asian perspective and an Indian perspective of China and its place in the world and how we perceive the West relationship with China, I think what we've learned today, very importantly, is a Eurocentric perception of China. We've seen a British sort of centric perception of China. We see how Europe as a continent, Europe as a military and an economic power, how the UK as a military and an economic power views China, and more importantly, views the sort of emerging competition between the US, China. So I think if we take anything from today's conversation, it's that is the sort of European perspective, because at the end of the day, India and Europe and the US are allies in democracy. We have shared democratic values. We have a desire to see global human rights sort of spread. We have closely aligned values when it comes to climate change and free trade and secure maritime routes. And it's important for us to understand each other and how we see common frenemies or adversaries. And I think we got a lot of that insight today. So thank you, Dr. Leoni, for speaking with us. Please, everybody, stay safe, wear your masks, have a lovely, lovely evening, and thanks for attending. Have a good day. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I still have a vote of thanks to present.
Oh, sorry, Bala.
That's okay.
This is my first time. We can blame Bala.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Tanvir, for accepting and moderating and steering through the session.
Yes.
It is indeed a great pleasure for me to present this vote of thanks. And thank you very much, Dr. Zeno Leoni, for taking time out to be with us. We wish you great success in all your future endeavors. I also take this opportunity to thank all the veterans officers who have been with us here today for taking the time out to be with us. Thank you very much for your participation. And this is also an opportunity to thank all the young ardent research scholars, students from various universities, interns of C3S, who have really taken out time out to be with us. And last but not the least, I should also thank my colleague, Ms. Nisha, who have been constantly giving her support for making this happen. It would be really an honor to present my thanks to my director, Commodore R.S. Vasan, who is not able to be with us here today because of the Wuhan virus, the pandemic, that he was not able to participate. Without his backing and support, this would not been really possible. Thank you very much. With this, I would like to conclude the session. Jai Hind. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot. It was